You know, life has a funny way of painting a masterpiece and convincing you it's a photograph. A perfect, static, unchangeable image of happiness. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have sworn my life was a photograph. I had it all. A thriving logistics business I'd built from the ground up, a beautiful wife, Sarah, whose laughter was the soundtrack to my world, and a home that felt less like a house and more like a monument to our shared success. I worked hard, yes, but the work was a currency I spent on us. On Sarah. On the life we had sketched out on diner napkins and whispered about in the dark since we were teenagers. She was my high school sweetheart, the constant star in my personal constellation. Our bond, I believed, was forged in something stronger than time or circumstance. From the outside, I was a man who had won the lottery of life. Friends, colleagues, even strangers at industry events would clap me on the shoulder and say, "Michael, you're the luckiest man alive." And I, in my blissful ignorance, believed them. I never thought to question why Sarah's smile no longer reached her eyes, why its light seemed to flicker and dim. Perhaps it was the arrogance of a man who believes his own press, or the naive faith of a man who has only ever known one great love. Whatever the reason, I missed the signs. They began as whispers, not shouts. A missed call here, a late night there, explained away with the easy, plausible lies of a busy life. "Work is just crazy right now," she'd say, or, "I just needed some girl time with my friends." And I, feeling a pang of guilt, would nod. "You've been so busy, Michael," she'd add, a subtle but brilliant move that shifted the blame onto my shoulders, making me the architect of her growing distance. I didn't know then that later, the time when I promised to make it up to her, was a future she was no longer invested in. I will never forget the first time the cold tendril of doubt snaked its way into my heart. It was subtle, a shadow at the periphery of my vision. Her phone had become a fifth limb, a constant companion that journeyed with her from room to room, even into the sanctity of the bathroom. She would laugh at messages on its screen, a private, silent mirth she never offered to share. I asked her about it once, my tone a carefully constructed casualness. "Oh, just a group chat with the girls," she'd said, the lie as smooth and polished as a river stone. I believed her because the alternative was a landscape of pain I was not yet ready to explore. Then came the excuses, flimsy structures that began to collapse under the slightest scrutiny. "I'm going to a yoga class," she'd announce, but return hours later with perfectly coiffed hair and not a single drop of sweat, her yoga mat conspicuously absent. When I offered to drive her, to participate in this new hobby, she grew defensive. "I need my space, Michael. Space from me." The words were a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. But I swallowed the pain, my own guilt a willing accomplice to her deception. "I'm working too much," I told myself. "She feels neglected." I tried to fix it. I tried to repair the cracks I was only just beginning to see. I planned elaborate date nights at her favorite restaurants. I filled the house with her favorite flowers. I even cleared my schedule for an entire weekend, a logistical feat of Herculean proportions in my line of work. But she was a ghost at the table, a beautiful, smiling phantom. She was there, physically, but her spirit, her essence, had already departed for some other, unknown shore. It was in the way she looked at me, or rather, the way she looked through me. The eyes that once held a universe of warmth and admiration now held only a polite, vacant recognition. The final, irreparable crack in the foundation of my world arrived in the form of a man named Lucas. He walked into my office one afternoon, unannounced, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered on his face. He claimed to be a potential business partner, an entrepreneur looking for a logistics expert. I meet a lot of people in my line of work, but there was something about him that set every nerve in my body on edge. He was too smooth, too practiced, a man who wore his confidence like an ill-fitting suit. And then, he said her name. He spoke it with a casual, almost proprietary familiarity, as if he were discussing a shared asset. The sound of her name in his mouth sent a chill down my spine. He was a master of insinuation, never saying anything directly, but planting seeds of doubt with every carefully chosen word. "You've got a great life here, Michael," he said, his eyes scanning my office, my awards, the picture of Sarah and me on my desk. His tone was a toxic cocktail of admiration and contempt. Must be nice, having everything you want. That night, the question I had been too afraid to ask finally escaped my lips. Do you know a guy named Lucas? She froze. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of panic in her eyes so brief that if you weren't looking for it, you would have missed it. Then, she laughed, a sound that was too loud, too sharp, too brittle. Lucas? No, never heard of him. What? I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But the seed of doubt, planted by her own actions, had just been watered by his arrogance and her lie. His smug, predatory face was burned into my mind. Something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. But I wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Looking back, I see the man I was with a kind of pitying clarity. A man so desperate to protect the photograph of his perfect life that he refused to see the masterpiece of deceit being painted right in front of him. The cracks were there, and the entire structure was about to come crashing down. It's a funny thing about your gut. It starts as a whisper, a gentle suggestion that something is amiss. You can ignore it, rationalize it away, bury it under a mountain of willful ignorance. But if you ignore it for too long, it learns to scream. My gut had been whispering for months. After the visit from Lucas, it began to shriek. The rational part of my brain, the part that had built a logistics empire on order and predictability, fought back. Sarah was my bedrock. She was the constant in every equation of my life. To doubt her was to doubt the very laws of my own emotional physics. But the signs were no longer whispers. They were billboards, neon and flashing, on a dark and lonely highway. Lucas wasn't just a potential business partner. He was an invading army, and he had already breached the gates. My instincts, now fully awake and screaming for action, would not let me rest. His smug, possessive tone, the way he said your life, as if it were a territory he was in the process of colonizing. It haunted my waking hours and stalked me in my dreams. So, I did something the old Michael, the trusting, naive Michael, would have found abhorrent. I hired a private investigator. It felt like a betrayal in itself, a shameful admission that the trust in my own marriage had eroded to the point of needing external verification. But the alternative, a direct confrontation based on nothing but a gut feeling and the smirk of a stranger, was a path to mutual destruction. If I was wrong, I would have poisoned our marriage with my own paranoia. But if I was right, I needed proof. I needed a weapon. I will never forget the moment Daniel, the PI, handed me the folder. It was a simple, unassuming manila folder, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. It was thicker than I had anticipated, far thicker. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, as I flipped it open. The contents were a systematic, brutal demolition of the life I thought I had. Photographs, timestamps, credit card receipts. There she was, my Sarah, the woman whose face was as familiar to me as my own reflection. But she was a stranger, living a secret, parallel life. There she was, laughing with him, with Lucas, at a candlelit dinner. There she was, her hand in his, their fingers intertwined, as they walked through a park. There she was, kissing him in the anonymous intimacy of a parking garage. There she was, checking into a hotel, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder. The woman in the photographs was not the distant, tired wife I came home to. She was vibrant, alive, her face alight with a joy and passion I hadn't seen in years. And that, more than anything, was the blade that gutted me. He hadn't just stolen her body, he had stolen her light. Lucas, in every frame, was a portrait of smug victory. He was born to play the villain in someone else's tragedy, and he was clearly relishing the role. I sat in my office for hours, the folder open on my desk, the silence of the empty building pressing in on me. The initial shock gave way to a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. And then, finally, the grief curdled into a cold, clarifying rage. This man, this parasite, had the audacity to walk into my office, to survey my life, and then to try and sell me a partnership? The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost impressive. And Sarah, she wasn't just a passive victim in his scheme. She was a willing, and apparently happy, co-conspirator. When I finally confronted her, it was with a preternatural calm that I didn't know I possessed. The rage was still there, a white-hot core deep inside me, but it was contained, controlled. I would not give her the satisfaction of a shouting match, of a dramatic, tear-filled scene. That was their world, a world of cheap, manufactured drama. My world was one of cold, hard facts. I laid the folder on our polished kitchen island. She was humming, unpacking groceries, the picture of domestic tranquility. She looked up, a questioning smile on her face, and then her eyes fell to the folder. She knew, instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pale, translucent mask of terror. She looked like the girl I'd known in high school, caught cheating on a test, vulnerable and utterly exposed. "Michael," she began, her voice a trembling whisper. "Don't," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not anymore. Just tell me the truth." And she did. Not all at once. It came out in a torrent of half-truths, justifications, and tearful deflections. A confusing, chaotic narrative of her own betrayal. She told me how it had started, how Lucas had made her feel seen, how my long hours at work had made her feel neglected and lonely. "You were never home, Michael," she said, the words an attempt to reframe her infidelity as a consequence of my failure. I needed someone to talk to. I listened, my face a stone mask. Did she really believe that? Did she think I built my business, that I worked those relentless hours for my own amusement? Every contract signed, every deal closed, every sleepless night was a brick I was laying in the foundation of the life I thought she wanted. Our life. But in the end, the reasons didn't matter. She had made a choice. The next day, while she was out, I packed a bag. I wasn't going to fight for a woman who had so thoroughly and enthusiastically replaced me. When she came home and saw my suitcase by the door, she didn't try to stop me. Perhaps, in her own twisted way, she saw this as her victory. The boring, workaholic husband was finally out of the picture, leaving the stage clear for her and her exciting new leading man. But Lucas wasn't done with me. A week later, the messages started. Taunting, cruel, juvenile texts designed to inflict maximum pain. Asterisk, "She's happier now, Michael. You were holding her back." Asterisk, and then, the one that made the rage inside me crystallize into something harder, more dangerous. "You're nothing compared to me." He was relentless, a hyena circling a wounded lion, nipping and tearing, trying to provoke a reaction. Sarah, I was sure, was a willing audience to his cruelty. But Lucas didn't know me. He didn't know the man he was provoking. He saw a simple, heartbroken husband. He had no concept of the strategic, patient, and utterly ruthless mind that had built an empire from nothing. I had ignored him at first. But then he made the fatal mistake that all arrogant men make. He underestimated his opponent. And that's when the game truly began. You would think, wouldn't you, that a man who has successfully stolen another man's wife would have the good sense to retreat and enjoy his spoils. But that's not how men like Lucas operate. For them, the victory is not in the acquisition. It's in the humiliation of the vanquished. He didn't just want Sarah. He needed me to know, in visceral, excruciating detail, that he had her. He needed me to suffer. It was a pathology, a deep-seated insecurity that masqueraded as dominance. The initial barrage of texts was a crude, blunt force trauma. Short, sharp jabs of poison delivered to my phone at all hours. "She's better off now." A picture of them at dinner, Sarah smiling, a glass of wine raised in a toast. "You gave her a house, but I give her a life." I could almost picture the scene. Him, composing the messages with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Her, looking on, perhaps with a flicker of guilt, but more likely with the complicit laughter of a co-conspirator. The thought made me physically ill. My initial strategy was one of stoic silence. To respond would be to engage in his juvenile game, to validate his tactics. I deleted the texts, blocked the numbers, and tried to pour my pain and rage into the only thing I still controlled, my work. The company became my fortress, the cold, hard logic of logistics a balm for the chaos in my soul. But Lucas was a predator who mistook a lack of engagement for weakness. He escalated. The first time he showed up at my office, it felt like a violation of a sacred space. I was in a quarterly review with my senior team, dissecting shipping routes and profit margins, when he strolled in, unannounced, uninvited. He was wearing a suit that was a size too small and a grin that was 10 sizes too large. "Michael," he said, his voice booming with a false bonhomie that set my teeth on edge. "How's life treating you?" A blanket of uncomfortable silence fell over the conference room. My team, my loyal, hard-working team, looked from me to this smirking stranger, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. I kept my own expression a neutral mask. I would not let him have the satisfaction of seeing me crack. "I'm in a meeting, Lucas," I said, my voice even, my gaze steady. I gestured toward the door. "If you need something, you can make an appointment with my assistant." "Oh, I don't need anything," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, a picture of insouciant arrogance. "Just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're holding up. You know, now that Sarah's moved on to bigger and better things." His eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of the room, a clear insinuation that my world, my company, was small and insignificant compared to his. "Must be hard, though, running this whole place all on your own." Every primal instinct screamed at me to launch myself across that table and wipe that condescending grin off his face. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the blood pounding in my ears. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was exactly what he wanted. A reaction, a public display of anger that would validate his narrative of me as the unstable, jealous ex-husband. Instead, I stood up slowly. I walked to the door and opened it wider, a silent, unmistakable command. "You're done here," I said, my voice quiet, but laced with a steel he could not have missed. "Leave." For a moment, I thought he might challenge me. A flicker of something, surprise, disappointment, crossed his face. Then he laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed in the silent room. "Suit yourself," he said, turning to go. But he couldn't resist one final, parting shot. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes glinting with malice. "I took your wife and your life, Michael. Face it, you're nothing without me." I didn't respond. I simply watched him walk away, his swagger a hollow performance for an audience of one. As the door clicked shut, I turned back to my team, who were all staring at me, their expressions a mixture of shock and sympathy. I took a deep breath. "Now," I said, my voice regaining its normal, authoritative tone, "where were we?" I believe we were discussing the third quarter projections for the West Coast corridor. I let him leave. I let him believe he had won that skirmish. But inside, a war had just been declared. His words, "I took your wife and your life," replayed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a clarification of the stakes. He was wrong. He hadn't taken my life. Not yet. He had merely shown me exactly how much he was willing to lose. You can only push a man so far. And Lucas had just pushed me over the edge. The man who walked out of that conference room was not the same man who had walked in. The grief and the shock had been cauterized by a white-hot, righteous fury. Lucas, in his infinite arrogance, had made a critical error. He had mistaken my patience for passivity. He thought he was playing a game of emotional terrorism, but he had just walked onto a battlefield of my choosing, and he was hopelessly, laughably outmatched. I am not, by nature, an impulsive man. My empire was not built on gut feelings or reckless gambles. It was built on data, on strategy, on the quiet, methodical dismantling of complex problems. Lucas was a complex problem, and I would dismantle him with the same dispassionate precision I applied to a failing supply chain. My first call was back to Daniel, the PI. The brief was no longer just about observation. It was about acquisition. "I want everything on Lucas Croft," I said, my voice a low, controlled monotone. "His financials, his business dealings, his personal history. I want to know where he is leveraged, who he owes money to, who he has crossed. I want every skeleton in his closet, and I want the key to the lock." While Daniel's team began their digital and real-world archaeology, I began my own psychological warfare. Lucas relied on bravado. I would rely on strategy. He wanted a brawl. I would give him a chess match. The information from Daniel began to paint a picture not of a brilliant mastermind, but of a common grifter with a high-gloss finish. Lucas was a con artist. He moved from one small-time scam to another, leaving a trail of broken promises and drained bank accounts. He preyed on women who were emotionally vulnerable, divorcees, widows, women like Sarah who felt neglected or unappreciated. He was a parasite, charming his way into their lives, feeding on their resources and their hope, and then moving on when the host was bled dry. Sarah was not his first victim. She was just his latest, and, given my resources, his most lucrative. Daniel's report was a damning chronicle of human wreckage. A single mother in Arizona who had lost her home after Lucas convinced her to invest her savings in a fictitious real estate scheme. A small business owner in Colorado whose company had been driven into bankruptcy by his fraudulent partnership. Each story was a variation on the same theme, a pattern of calculated deceit, emotional manipulation, and financial ruin. But Lucas didn't just leave a trail of broken hearts. He left a trail of bitter, angry enemies. Ex-business partners he had double-crossed. Former friends he had swindled. Even a few distant relatives who had been burned by his schemes. He wasn't just disliked. He was loathed, a man who had sown so much bad faith that the world was full of people quietly wishing for his downfall. And that, I realized, was his Achilles heel. He believed he was a lone wolf, a brilliant predator. In reality, he was a man surrounded by a silent, patient pack of hunters, and I was about to give them a signal. Armed with this dossier of his sins, I began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He projected an image of effortless success, but Daniel's financial analysis revealed he was leveraged to the hilt, living on a mountain of debt, constantly juggling payments, robbing Peter to pay a very anxious Paul. He wasn't invincible. He was fragile, a puff of wind away from total collapse. My next step was to reach out, quietly, carefully, through intermediaries and third parties. I began to make contact with the people Lucas had wronged. I didn't reveal my identity. I was a concerned party, a fellow victim, a potential investor who had uncovered some disturbing information. I needed to gauge their willingness to act, to share their stories, their evidence. To my surprise, it took very little convincing. The wounds Lucas had inflicted were still raw, the desire for justice still burning. They were more than willing to talk. A flood of documents began to arrive at a secure P.O. box Daniel had set up. Canceled checks, fraudulent contracts, sworn affidavits, tearful emails. I was no longer just building a file. I was building an army. By the time I was done, I had a complete, multi-dimensional map of Lucas Croft's life of crime. I knew his scams, his lies, his debts. I knew the names of the people he was hiding from and the shell corporations he was hiding behind. He had spent a lifetime building a house of cards on a foundation of other people's pain, and I was about to summon the wind. I felt no guilt, no moral ambiguity about what I was planning. Lucas had walked into my life and declared war. He had chosen the weapons, deceit, manipulation, humiliation. I would simply turn those same weapons back on him, but with a precision and a force he could not possibly comprehend. This was no longer just about Sarah. This was about a fundamental restoration of order. It was about justice. And justice, as they say, is a dish best served cold. Lucas believed he was a master puppeteer, pulling the strings of everyone around him. He saw Sarah not as a partner, but as his most valuable puppet, a symbol of his conquest. He was so focused on the puppet, he never thought to look up and see who was controlling the stage. His greatest weakness wasn't his debt or his enemies. It was the woman sleeping next to him. I knew Sarah, her insecurities, her vanities, her fears, better than he ever could. And I would use that knowledge to unravel him from the inside out. The first move was not an attack, but a carefully calibrated act of psychological warfare. I reached out to Sarah, not with anger, not with accusations, but with the quiet, sorrowful tone of a man who has accepted defeat. I asked her to meet for coffee, not to reconcile, but to discuss the logistics of the separation. She was hesitant, but my passive, non-confrontational approach disarmed her. We met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe she didn't frequent. She arrived looking like a woman trying too hard to project happiness. The designer handbag, the expensive new coat, it was all part of the costume for her new life. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a hairline crack in the porcelain facade. I didn't mention Lucas, not at first. I spoke of our shared history, of the good times, not in a way that was pleading, but with a wistful, nostalgic sadness. I was planting seeds of doubt, reminding her of the genuine, solid foundation she had abandoned for this thrilling, but ultimately hollow, new structure. Then, and only then, did I introduce the first tremor. It's funny, I said, swirling the last of my coffee in its cup. I ran into an old business acquaintance the other day. He mentioned he knew Lucas. Small world, isn't it? I saw it. A flash of panic in her eyes, quickly masked by a forced, bright smile. Oh, really? What did he say? Nothing bad. I lied, my tone a masterpiece of casual indifference. Just interesting. You know, you think you know someone, but their past is always a mystery. I left it at that. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The seed was planted. Lucas had undoubtedly curated a very specific, and likely fictitious, version of his past for her. Now, for the first time, she would begin to wonder what was real and what was part of the performance. Over the next few weeks, I became a ghost in her new life, a subtle, disquieting presence. I would send her sporadic, civil texts about practical matters, mail that had arrived for her, a question about a shared insurance policy. But within these mundane messages, I would embed more seeds of doubt. Asterisk, saw an interesting article about real estate investment scams in Arizona today. Made me think of what you said about Lucas's old business. Asterisk, hope you're doing well. Heard the market in Colorado is tough for small businesses these days. Asterisk, each message was a breadcrumb leading her down a path of her own discovery. It worked even better than I had anticipated. Sarah, her curiosity piqued and her own insecurities now activated, began to pull at the threads. She started asking me questions, her voice tinged with a worry she tried to disguise as casual conversation. What did you mean? That time you mentioned Lucas's past was complicated. I feigned reluctance. Sarah, I don't want to cause trouble between you two. You're happy, and that's all that matters. It was the perfect move. By refusing to give her the information directly, I made her even more desperate for it. I was no longer the accuser. I was the concerned, benevolent ex-husband, which made my subtle insinuations all the more credible. She began her own investigation. A few late-night internet searches, a couple of discreet inquiries. And the more she dug, the more of Lucas's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She found the articles about his failed businesses. She found the angry online reviews from former clients. She found the trail of broken women. She was beginning to see him not as her savior, but as the con artist I knew him to be. The beauty of the strategy was its deniability. Lucas, blinded by his own arrogance, saw nothing amiss. He was too busy enjoying his victory to notice the ground shifting beneath his feet. And Sarah, my unwitting agent of chaos, was dismantling his credibility from within, all while believing it was her own idea. He had taken my wife, yes, but in doing so, he had handed me the very weapon I would use to bring him to his knees. Their perfect world was a mirage, and the desert winds were beginning to blow. The beautiful thing about a predator like Lucas is that their hunger is their undoing. His ego and his greed were two sides of the same insatiable coin. While he was busy basking in the glow of his perceived victory over me, I was busy building him a golden cage. Sarah, now fully immersed in her own quiet investigation, was becoming more distant from him, more questioning. The foundation of their fantasy was cracking, and it was time for me to introduce a seismic event. I needed to present Lucas with an opportunity so dazzling, so perfectly tailored to his delusions of grandeur, that he would walk into the trap without a moment's hesitation. Through a business acquaintance, a man Lucas had tried and failed to swindle years ago, and who now harbored a deep and abiding contempt for him, I planted the seed. A wealthy, reclusive investor, new to the city, was looking to make a significant, high-risk, high-reward investment in the logistics sector. This fictitious investor was looking for a partner with vision and guts, someone who wasn't afraid to bend the rules. It was a character profile I had designed to be Lucas's perfect mirror. To make the bait irresistible, I orchestrated it so the offer came through a second intermediary, another of Lucas's burned bridges. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The offer was not just an opportunity for wealth. It was a chance for Lucas to believe he was so brilliant that even his former enemies were now forced to come to him, hat in hand. His ego would not allow him to question it. He took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. I listened, through my network of informants, as he bragged to Sarah. This is it, he told her. This is the deal that sets us up for life. This proves everyone who ever doubted me wrong. He was so blinded by the promise of his own vindication that he never once stopped to question the convenient perfection of it all. The plan was set in motion. The fake investor, a professional actor I had hired for the part, arranged a final meeting to sign the papers. The location was key. It had to be a place that would appeal to Lucas's sense of drama and exclusivity. We chose a private, remote estate, an hour outside the city. It was an empty property, owned by yet another of his victims, a man who had been all too happy to lend it to me for a few hours of what he called poetic justice. Lucas thought he was driving to his coronation. He had no idea he was driving to his own tribunal. Meanwhile, I worked in the shadows, a ghost in the machine. Every detail was meticulously planned. The timing, the placement of the guests, the evidence that would be presented. Lucas's enemies, the army I had quietly assembled, were eager to play their parts. This was more than just my revenge, it was theirs. It was a collective reckoning. I was nowhere near the estate on the day of the meeting. My hands were clean. My name was not attached to any of it. Lucas had made so many enemies, had created so much chaos in his wake, that his downfall would seem like a natural, inevitable implosion. All I had done was gather the combustible materials in one place and provide a single, well-placed spark. The day arrived, a crisp, clear autumn afternoon. I sat in my office, a city away, looking out at the skyline. I imagined Lucas, dressed in his finest suit, his heart pounding with avarice and ambition, blissfully unaware of the ambush that awaited him. He believed he was the master of his own destiny, a man who could outsmart the world. But as his car turned down that long, secluded driveway, I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance. It was about a force of chaos finally meeting an immovable object of consequence. Lucas had spent a lifetime taking. It was time for him to finally pay. The day of Lucas's reckoning was, by all accounts, a beautiful one. The kind of day that seems to mock the ugliness of human affairs with its indifferent perfection. Lucas, I was later told, arrived at the estate with the swagger of a king arriving at his castle. He stepped out of his car, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, and strode toward the grand entrance, a man on the precipice of his greatest triumph. The interior of the estate was not filled with lawyers and champagne, as he had imagined. It was filled with ghosts. The ghosts of his past, made flesh. The woman from Arizona, her face etched with a quiet, steely resolve. The business partner from Colorado, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold fury. The brother of the young woman who had taken her own life, his eyes burning with a grief that had, over the years, hardened into something far more dangerous. They were all there, a silent, waiting jury. The man Lucas thought was the investor, the actor I had hired, greeted him not with a handshake, but with a simple, damning question. Do you know these people, Mr. Croft? The blood, I'm told, drained from Lucas's face. His confident smirk faltered, then collapsed entirely, replaced by a look of dawning, animalistic terror. He recognized them. Of course he did. They were the wreckage he had left in his wake, the human cost of his ambition, and they had all come back to haunt him. The confrontation was not a physical one. It was far more brutal. One by one, they presented their cases. They laid out the evidence of his crimes with a calm, chilling precision. The fraudulent contracts, the forged signatures, the emptied bank accounts. It was a systematic, public vivisection of his entire life of lies. He tried to deny it, to charm his way out, to lie and deflect as he had always done. But his usual tricks were useless here. This was not a single, vulnerable victim he could manipulate. This was a chorus of the damned, and their voices were united against him. I was not there. My presence would have tainted the purity of the justice being served. This was not about a cuckolded husband getting his revenge. This was about a predator finally being held accountable by his prey. I had merely opened the cage door. By the time it was over, Lucas was a broken man. He stumbled out of that estate stripped of his arrogance, his lies, his very identity. His empire, which had only ever existed in his own mind, had been reduced to ash. As his car sped away down the long driveway, he was not just leaving a house. He was fleeing from the total and complete collapse of his own reality. The aftermath was swift and total. The evidence gathered in that room was immediately turned over to the authorities. A warrant was issued for his arrest on multiple counts of fraud. The story, leaked to the press by one of the victims, became a local sensation, a cautionary tale of a charismatic con man finally brought to justice. His world didn't just unravel, it evaporated. His business contacts vanished. The friends he had cultivated turned their backs. The bank froze his accounts. He was a man without a future, a ghost haunted by his own past. Sarah, of course, was caught in the blast radius. She called me the night the story broke, her voice a hysterical, sobbing mess. Michael, did you see? Did you know about this? I heard things, Sarah, I said, my voice a calm, steady anchor in her storm. Her trust in him, already eroded, shattered completely. She confronted him, and in his desperation, he likely confessed, or at least failed to lie convincingly. The final, brutal truth of the man she had thrown her life away for was laid bare. She left him. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. The exciting, passionate savior she had imagined was just a common criminal, a pathetic fraud. She returned to the house we had once shared, not as a triumphant victor, but as a refugee from her own disastrous choices. As for Lucas, he did what all cowards do when the walls close in. He ran. He skipped bail, vanished into the night, becoming a fugitive from the law and from the wreckage of his own life. The dust began to settle. The chaos receded. Lucas was gone. Sarah was a shell of her former self, living in a quiet purgatory of her own making. And I was finally free. The war was over. And in the silence that followed, I began the slow, quiet work of rebuilding. Not my business, not my house, but myself.